Great. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started with our session today. Armando, if you could just mute yourself, that would be lovely. Thank you. So our session today is part of the series on post-pandemic planning in the South. And this session is hosted by the EJUR cluster in DPU, which is works on environmental justice, urbanization, and resilience. And today, the topic of our session, or the title, is Our Home is on Fire, Climate Emergency and the Pandemic. And my name is Cassidy Johnson. I'm a professor of urbanism and disaster risk reduction at DPU. And I'm very pleased to be joined today by Professor Vanessa Caston-Broto, who's a professor of climate urbanism at the Urban Institute, University of Sheffield. And among other things, today we'll talk about Vanessa's recent work as one of the lead authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC Working Group 2-6 Assessment Report, where she mostly worked on the chapter on Chapter 6, Cities, Settlements, and Key Infrastructure. And her work focuses on governance of global environmental change in the urbanization age. And I'm also very pleased to have two of my DPU colleagues here. Well, Vanessa used to be our colleague at DPU, but two of my current DPU colleagues here who are going to make some comments near the end of the session. We have Dr. Lisa Griffin, who's a lecturer in environmental politics and works on urban health, and she thinks about how to govern complex political problems for environmental sustainability and social justice. So thank you, Lisa. And Dr. Andrea Rigon, who's associate professor at DPU, teaches on social diversity, inequality, and poverty. And he's also very interested in research on climate justice and intersectionality. So he's been developing some research ideas on that. He's also chair of Catalytic Action, a charity that works to empower vulnerable children in their communities through participatory spatial intervention. So thank you, Andrea. We look forward to your comments at the end of today. So in this session, what we'd like to do is to discuss some of the key findings particularly from Chapter 6 of the IPCC Working Group 2 report. And what we're going to do is start with a video which has just been released, which tells us about some of the major findings of this Working Group 2 report. And we're going to then we're going to have a question and answer with Vanessa and I afterwards. And then we'll have some interventions from Dr. Griffin and Dr. Rigon. So what we're interested in, or some of the key findings from this report, I'll just give a couple headlines you can look for in the video, is that in all cities and urban areas, the risks faced by people and assets from hazard associated with climate change has increased, and that these impacts are felt disproportionately in socially and economically marginalized communities, and particularly urban communities. And that the pandemic has revealed some of this systematic underinvestment that's resulted in some of these health vulnerabilities. And we'll look at that in the video. So the video is just under 14 minutes. So we'll start with that, and then we'll ask Vanessa some questions to sort of tease out some of the things coming out of the IPCC report. So Armando, who's our lovely organizer of these event series, if you could please start the video, that would be lovely. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thanks for playing that, Armando. And I think, looking through for example, the Chapter 6 on cities and on urban areas, you can see the extent of the number of publications that this report is drawing on, and the sort of the density of it. But I think that I'd like to ask Vanessa a number of questions, or maybe a bit of a conversation between us about talking about this as they were saying at the end, the consequences of inaction. And I think, us coming from the development planning unit, what we're very interested in are what are the actions. And so I'd like to ask some questions around that. But Vanessa, just to start off, maybe if you could tell us quickly a little bit about your experience in being part of this IPCC report and sort of the extent of professionals from around the world and the things that you have to look at, the number of publications, and how does that all work?
Yeah, thank you, Cassidy. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you all. All good friends around. And thank you for inviting me to talk about the IPCC. And I'm always very cautious about talking about the IPCC because contrary to other cases, sorry, Cassidy, your mic, can you turn it off? Oh, that's a little better. So contrary to other reports or academic works that you do and you feel that you have a strong authorship, in this case is, as you saw from the video, it's a very polyvocal kind of result that really emerges from dialogue and discussion and in a way that makes you a bit anxious about presenting it as something that is mine particularly, and not from the other hundreds of scientists that have participated on it. But the process was absolutely fascinating. It was 4 years, and we met every 6 months for 2 weeks, and we did discuss every section by section, in every meeting. And in every meeting, so in the first meeting, we produced a draft, like the zero order draft. And then each draft was reviewed, and for each draft, we received an increased number of reviews. So the first time, I think it was a few hundred, like 500. The last time, I think it was over 3,000. So we had to go one by one through all the reviews and respond one by one to all of them. Then there's two things that you have to do. One, when there's a point that is very strong and that you feel that you really need to put it across, you want to reinforce that point on the one hand by writing it clearly, but on the other hand, by providing appropriate evidence. So a lot of the work is also looking for the evidence that supports the point. That a lot of the findings of the report, I think they are, on the obvious side of the debates that we had at DPU. These are things that many people at the DPU have been saying for years, not least Cassidy, of course. And what is strong here is that we have gone systematically through the literature to show that there's significant evidence from different parts of the world about those specific points. For example, about how inequality impacts vulnerability and so on. And then the other thing is, when there are things that are controversial, we have to reflect a little bit about how to present it in the report so that it can be approved. As you know, the final summary of the report is approved line by line by all the governments that participate in the report. So what you don't want is to do a report which is very radical, and then you arrive to the governments and the governments don't approve it. So you don't want to risk that. So how can you convey some of the points? So for example, the points on gender, they were quite controversial in the governmental review. So how can you write them so that they can pass through the review? So it's a bit of a strategic work also to be done there. Does that answer your question, Cassidy?
Yes, I think so.
Just to say that this was super diverse, as you saw in the video as well. There were people from all over, and we did actually efforts to bring voices that you often wouldn't see represented in a report like this. In particular, we did a separate peer review process for indigenous people to present evidence that normally wouldn't be peer reviewed. So we peer reviewed it ourselves so that it was prepared for the meeting.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think that gives us some understanding of the process that you've been through as part of this, and I think it's a very comprehensive. I don't know exactly how it is used, but maybe we'll come to that in a minute. I wanted to ask you a bit about some of the actions. So the first question I have is, what do you think is the room for maneuver in climate change adaptation in urban environments? How can we sort of make some inroads into improving adaptive responses?
Okay, so like obviously we can go more in detail about the specific responses, but one of the things that this report shows is that our capacity to adapt to climate change is reduced for any increase of warming. So they say in one of the summaries it says, every degree of warming reduces significantly and exponentially our capacity to adapt. So both the reduction of carbon emissions and the possibilities of adaptation are intrinsically linked. And obviously there are things already we cannot adapt to. And the number of things we cannot adapt to is going to increase as the impacts of climate change become deeper and more frequent and more serious. Well, they're already very serious, but like that will only worsen. So I would say the room for maneuver, whatever that is, it is kind of reducing quite fast. But I would say that this report, what it does, it tries to look for what can we do in two ways. So as you saw the chairs of the report saying, there's a strong emphasis on responding and on finding solutions, and also not only on making a list. So Deborah Roberts, for example, who is one of the chairs, was explaining that it's not about just making a list of responses, although many responses are listed, but about explaining how those responses work in context. Because already since the report that was published in 2014, the fifth assessment report that preceded this one, there's a strong sense that there has to be context-driven responses to climate change. So the report, in chapter 6 in particular, we emphasize this notion of climate resilient development pathways, which is the kind of trajectories which wouldn't necessarily be linear, but the kind of pathways, the kind of ways forward, let's say, that you can take in different contexts and in different situations. And from within those climate resilient development pathways, I think what that notion does for the climate adaptation literature is to look, on the one hand, yes, there are specific solutions, no? Like if you make a contention wall or you make a particular measures to protect the ICT infrastructure or something like that. So there are specific measures that you can take. But actually those measures have to be integrated and coordinated and perhaps integrated in wider context, in wider that include governance, include finance, include the possibility of developing capacity to act at different levels within the same city, so that all the kind of different actors, public, private, communities, and etc., can have the space to take that action. So this notion of climate resilient development pathways for me is so valuable precisely because it focuses on those enabling factors, on those conditions that make action possible, and that kind of create, perhaps support that room for maneuver. Although we know that within the context of things that you could do, there's a large variety, and also the question that we are having maladaptation, we are having a lot of evidence of maladaptation suggests that maybe it's possible also sometimes to think that no action may be a good action in some cases. So we have to consider, as I say, within a given context. I think the video made emphasis that now perhaps more than ever, there's a need for transformative responses. But actually the report is very nuanced. Our chapter makes a big case of thinking about what is the transformative, what is actually transformative. Do we always need something transformative? Or are there cases in which incremental action could be safer maybe, or not create an adaptation? Or there are cases in which the incremental action becomes transformative, as we see in a lot of our experiences with communities, right?
Thanks, Vanessa. Yeah, and I think that probably a lot of the work that we do in the DPU, although it might not be labeled climate resilient development, is working towards those kind of pathways.
Okay.
So I think that's interesting to put it that way. My second question for you is, can adaptation planning contribute more widely to achieving synergies with other SDGs? While aiming at a more resilient post-pandemic future, but more I'm interested in the different synergies with the SDGs.
So I think, sorry, Cassidy, your mic, can you turn it off? Thank you. So I really like it. So this, the kind of community that works around climate change in this report, they really like this notion of systems as a way of organizing reality. And I really like the way Hans Otto Porter explains at the end of the video. Like, it is really what we are looking is at this interaction between these three systems. And there's the climate system, there is the human society, and there is the biodiversity system. And that is where the report makes emphasis on how this report has put both the biodiversity crisis and the diverse crises of our society, including inequality and urbanization, at the core of the report. And they really they are foreground. I think already the first messages, the first policy messages is that urbanization, inequality, and loss of biodiversity are the three factors that are driving climate change impacts and vulnerability. So basically, I don't think anybody imagines that it's possible to address climate change without addressing the Sustainable Development Goals. This was already something which was very highlighted and very strong in what is called a special report, which is a report that the IPCC does in between. So they have these big assessments reports, this is the 6. So there have been 6 of them, and they happen every 7 years or 8 years. But in the meantime, they do special reports for things that are kind of urgent. So they have a smaller group of scientists doing a specific report. And one of the last was about the possibility of keeping global temperatures under 1.5, the change in global average temperatures under 1.5 degrees. So, and there was a whole report dedicated to investigate that hypothesis, whether it was possible, whether it would constitute a significant advantage. And the report concluded that indeed, if we could keep temperature changes under 1.5 degrees, we will have a better chance to ensure the livability and the survival of our societies. But what that report also did was to put at the core of any action the Sustainable Development Goals as drivers of, as kind of points of entry to address vulnerabilities, different factors that drive vulnerabilities. Does that answer your question?
I think that in a way it does, yeah. I mean, I think that these, yeah, of course, addressing the SDGs is addressing those same probably drivers of vulnerability that are making that people can't adapt to climate change. So I think there's a lot of similarities across those. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what do you think are promising avenues for adaptation finance and for urban infrastructure?
Yeah, so I think so the report focuses on 3 areas of intervention in urban environments. And one is physical infrastructure that it was highlighted in the video, and it's almost the first thing we all think about, like doing protections or that kind of thing, or affecting the Cassidy. Can you turn off the mic? Okay. But thank you. But I think the other thing that the report does, and the other thing that has grown a lot of evidence since 2014. So in 2014, these things were already pointed at, but now we have a lot of evidence. First, that green and blue infrastructures are essential for climate adaptation. And the green infrastructures, for example, are already protecting a lot of coastal cities, as it was said in the film. And what we see sometimes is that maybe mangroves are removed to make space to coastal development, and then concrete-based protections are put instead of the green infrastructure, and that reduces the vulnerability of the city as a whole. So maybe you can securitize a hotel on the coast and create taking the economic opportunities that that gives you, but at the same time you're reducing you are increasing the risk for everybody else in the city. So I think the report makes a lot of emphasis on those green and blue infrastructures. and also things that normally people wouldn't put necessarily together with climate change, like for example, food production in the city or urban agriculture as key points of entry. Because why? Because droughts and famines are going to be likely associated with climate change. There are ways in which climate changes affect you at that distance, not necessarily just directly in the city. And then having food at hand may be the best way to counteract, to adapt to that kind of situation. So these are just minor examples, but just to show you that there's a greater emphasis on the potential of ecosystems to drive responses, adaptation responses to climate change. And that's true in cities, but even truer or equally true in other contexts. And then finally, particularly I think for cities, this is absolutely crucial. The report shows all the evidence about different forms of social policy, starting with health, and how that impacts our capacities for adaptation. So I think it makes a big emphasis on that. And the other day, I was in a training academy for the International Labour Organization, and they were talking about the future jobs that we will need in the context of climate change. And I was saying, well, we really have to start to think about how the way we treat care jobs and jobs in the care sector is affecting our capacity to adapt to climate change. Because I think the connection between health jobs and climate change is clearer in people's minds, but care jobs are equally important, and they are not well paid, they are not well treated. So this is the kind of debates that we have to open in climate change and say, well, actually these human systems, the way we are organizing care or health or education is actually working against our capacity to adapt to climate change. So perhaps we can start to think those sectors also from the perspective of climate adaptation.
Thanks, Vanessa. I mean, I can see, watching being part of this climate change adaptation sort of debates as it has grown over the years, and it sort of encompasses sort of more and more things that have to do with development and society and things like that. So when you start to talk about, for example, the care sector and how that, you really see how wide this topic of adapting to climate change is, and how linked it is to development in general.
You asked about finance. Do you want us to talk about that as well?
Yeah, you didn't really answer about finance. Would you like to say a couple words about that? I have a couple more questions, but go ahead on finance.
Yeah, sorry. In my mind, like in the report, I have separated the kind of solutions, like on the ground, like responses from the enabling factors, which I would say one would be finance. Yeah. So the evidence of this report is that at the moment, there's so little finance going to climate change. I mean, you all know that the governments are not meeting their promises. Whenever they go to the COPs, they still don't meet the promises. Very, very little finances, like only a fraction of what you would need. We don't even know how much finance you need, right? There's not been an estimation of that. But it is clear that it's very small and it doesn't contribute. So I don't know. I think one approach is to like continuing doing politics that hold accountable governments accountable, and kind of through the perspective of climate justice. So, I mean, the title of this session is "Our House is on Fire." This is Fridays for Future slogan, right? And they have really moved governments to take account of this challenge and the fact that they have to dedicate finance to adaptation as well. And it's possible that in Egypt we'll see some developments on that. But I think from the empirical experience that we are seeing, I think what we have to think also is what other sources of finance may appear to facilitate adaptation. And for planning, I think this is a very important question, because the Global Commission on Adaptation, for example, made a strong statement a couple of years ago saying that climate change is now the climate change adaptation, so responding to the risks of climate change, is one of the main concerns for most local governments worldwide. And this is whether you are in the US or in Namibia. So I think this is only going to increase. And I think local governments are going to be looking at how to finance climate adaptation as part of wider programs. So what we've always said about mainstreaming or something, mainstreaming adaptation is going to happen because it's just going to become a real concern But also what we are seeing is that a lot of people are financing privately coping actions to climate change. And I think that's where, you know, this debate that we always have about autonomy and responsibility, I think is something that we have to retake. What is this going to mean for climate change when people are financing, I don't know, their waste collection or the cleaning of the drainage, or I mean, at a very local level. So questions that are never away, too far away.
Or financing the losses that they have when there's a flood and things like that too.
Exactly, we haven't even.
Losses.
Yeah, we are just. I was just talking about prevention, but actually, the main issue is that a lot of people are suffering those losses already.
Yeah.
And people are already not being able to afford the cost of new land to which they have to move because their old land is already inundated.
Yeah, and also, you know, for heat events and the loss of just days of work and health issues and things like that, that people are financing all of that, aren't they?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the demands are huge. We definitely need more students, I think, working on this issue on climate finance and adaptation finance. It's very, very nice, very interesting field, I think, to work in. And so I might go to the question on climate justice, actually, which is, how do you think climate justice has been reconfigured in the last 15 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think we've seen a big challenge, a big change, and I think because, well, I don't know, maybe it's a big change that has only taken place in my mind. But I think when we were talking about climate justice, maybe let's say 15 years ago, at the mid-2000s, most people were thinking climate justice relates to global justice issues and configures climate change in a global political space. So for me, most debates were relating climate justice with historical depths and with the relationships between states. But I think what is happening, particularly in adaptation, but I think in mitigation, in the reduction of carbon emissions is also happening, is that a lot of people are starting to think about justice, climate justice, as it affects things that they are doing in their everyday life. And some of the debates that a decade only ago we were having under the banner of environmental justice are becoming also environmental justice issues. And that has become also part of what is the just transition, no? The idea, the just transition, for me, transitions have always been very local, and because that's how I've engaged with them theoretically. But for example, if we were looking at the first just transition policies published by countries like Spain, which was one of the first ones to do it, or by the European Union and so on, the idea of just transition was taken at a very kind of ample level, nationally driven and so on. But as those policies have been implemented and people are starting to talk about just transitions elsewhere, in Africa or in China, then it is clear that that just transition has to be very much related with specific actions that relate to the lives of people, or to local government, or to private business, or and so on. So I think that is reconfiguring ideas of justice. And what is happening at the moment is that a lot of climate justice debates is seen through the traditional lens of environmental justice theory. So this kind of tensions between, let's say, a liberal view of justice and ideas of distribution and ideas of recognition, participation, and so on. And more recently, the idea of limits, which is influencing a lot of debates on justice. But I think there's a need for something else. I think there's a need in which this more, I would say, classical environmental justice theory is not making justice to the challenges we are facing. And I wonder whether new theories of justice are going to come. And there's, of course, a lot of calls for kind of a decolonial view on justice, or views of justice that come from other places. And we try to put that forward in the report by this active effort to include indigenous people. And for some of us, we also try to include other kind of groups that we felt were excluded. But I don't see that change in the discourse. I actually see that for example, the ideas of justice from roles become now very much adapted in other contexts. So I have a lot of African colleagues that are working with that here. Sorry, I'm going too long.
No, good, thanks. Thanks, Vanessa. I think it's a good point to bring in Lisa and then Andrea for some comments. Lisa, would you like to go ahead?
Of course, thank you so much. Really great to hear you talk about this, Vanessa. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
Great. Your fascinating responses chime with a piece of research that I'm doing on healthy parks, and park spaces in and around London aren't just absolutely crucial for addressing health inequalities and well-being, but they're also really important spaces for climate mitigation and adaptation. So there are huge co-benefits, but one of the challenges in local authority governance is that these issues are considered separately. They have different money pots. They're governed by very different kind of policy regimes. So it's been a real challenge to try and bring these things together, which is one of the things that we want to do. I had a few sort of thoughts and observations that I've been thinking about myself around current debates in climate politics that I just wanted to share. One of the things that's becoming increasingly evident is that many of the crises that we're currently experiencing, like supply chain failures, cost of living crises, are actually matters of climate change. So the extreme dry weather that we've experienced in many regions globally over recent years have produced shortages of important cereals like durum wheat, and they've caused food prices to soar, by tens or more %. And they've caused a real problem in terms of food shortages and cost of living crises. And we might even actually reframe the invasion of Ukraine as a climate war. I mean, for example, we could plausibly understand the invasion as the desperate death throes of an autocracy sustained by carbon. So although it wasn't widely reported, back in, I think, autumn 2021, Ukraine signed a deal with the EU with the specific aim of trying to achieve a closer integration of supply chains around the minerals needed for renewable energies that are, of course, essential for decarbonising and moving towards these green transitions. And many of us will already know that climate change has played a fundamental role in the creation of the novel coronavirus. So research has shown, for example, how climatic changes like increases in temperature, sunlight, carbon dioxide, and so on, have altered forest habitats, creating the kinds of environments that are suitable for corona-carrying species like bats. It's also true that the very processes that contribute to climate change itself are also the ones thought to be responsible for the development of COVID-19. Human encroachment on forests via spatially extensive urbanization traverses the so-called wildlife frontier. And this process increases the interactions between domestic and wild animals and allows new, potentially lethal viruses to jump into our bodies. So it's very likely then that climate change is almost always enmeshed and entangled in the vast majority of problems that we're facing today, even though we may not call it as such. So for me, it's not just a question of unbundling these complex and integrated issues around poverty, hunger, conflict and migration. And that's because these issues are not simply related by linear lines of causality. They're almost always eternally and entirely enmeshed within the climate. So you can't just sort of unbundle them and separate them into different regimes or sectors. And I say that as a political ecologist, someone that likes to bring together nature and society, conceptually and practically. So I think that for these reasons, it can never be a question of simply firefighting global tragedies as something that as singular events or things that are unanticipated or exceptional. I think in order to make any meaningful headway, we've got to address them through and with climate change. And we've got to go beyond myopic approaches that center on responses concerned with individual behavior or political institutions. And I'm reminded that the social sciences in its sort of waves of trendiness sort of emphasizes different institutions or kinds of action at any one point. And we know from this recent IPCC report that we have to think in a much more integrated way. So coordinated change at every level and in every domain is clearly required. And we'll need new and collective ways, I think, of trying to bring these things together and addressing these vicious cycles in ways that make them more virtuous, as we saw in the video. We know that the poorest and most marginalized are always the most vulnerable, and they bear the least responsibility. So as Vanessa just explained beautifully, we need to coordinate our efforts in ways that put social justice and environmental sustainability together. So aligning our global and local responses to current challenges, which we may not readily see as climate change issues, presents an opportunity to create a more sustainable future for many more of us across the globe. And I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vanessa, or Lisa. Those are excellent comments, and thank you for making the links between all those events, including the pandemic. Andrea, I'll open the floor to you.
Thank you. First, just to say how much we need this event at the DPU, and so I'm very grateful for Vanessa and for Cassidy and Armando and all those organizing it, because I don't think we give enough importance to this kind of reflection. And my response will be very brief. Lisa said a lot of things that I can relate with, but I also think I'm going to give more a response coming from rage, almost an emotional response rather than an academic one. But the first point is really this report and also the feedback we get from Vanessa is really this centrality of inequalities in all the aspects related to climate change and adaptation. I think this report was so strong in that sense, and also looking at that adaptation apartheid that we have built, and how even that little adaptation finance that is there is actually contributing to this adaptation apartheid and that maladaptation, and also this strong expectation very often that I see on those most affected who did the least to cause climate change to actually do most work to adapt, even when they are supported by finance. So I think that's another aspect of that inequality. And of course, I really like what Vanessa said about context-driven responses, and I think there is where the DPU has a very important role, as we work a lot on the ways of involving different groups and people into decision making about, in this case, about adaptation at local level, because we know that people's identities across different axes of inequalities determine how they are affected by climate change, because of course this identity shape people's geography, livelihood, vulnerabilities, and of course the capacity to adapt. And so I think what we have collectively built at the DPU is this capacity of bringing those voices to influence those decision-making process. And also we have reflected a lot, sometimes not directly on climate change, but on the politics of knowledge that Vanessa told us at the beginning that was so important. So I would really think that we have with what we do at DPU an important role around our expertise on the co-production, on working on inequalities in participation, on the mechanism to ensure fair participation of unequal groups into both designing, producing adaptation, knowledge, and solution. But perhaps the message that I get very strong from today is this idea that we need to transform our way of life. And this is a provocation to the DPU. I feel sometimes I feel the bordering one when I say more strongly we really need to revisit the way we work and change the ways we work. How can it be possible that we don't track our contribution to climate change? How is it possible that in our ethic assessment, we don't put the travels and the carbon as part of the project? Is it worth it to cause so much climate change for that research output, or is there a different way of producing that research outputs or that teaching? Should we deliver some online only teaching programs? So in other ways, how can we avoid, and also how can we avoid to mainstream adaptation and climate change thinking into all of our projects, How can there be one project that doesn't consider that? As in all our projects, we need to consider gender and inclusion issues and diversity issues, which is fantastic. I think that today in 2022, we cannot do projects that do not consider at least that aspects as core to them. And I stop there.
Thank you, Andrea, for this very passionate response also. And I think, well, you're raising a lot of points we've discussed before, I think also, and things that we need to take forward. And I think really this difference around, you know, how we as a unit, as a department versus, you know, act accordingly in terms of reducing our emissions for climate change, and then the impacts that we can have in also making change in the world. So I think there's really big questions there. So thank you for that. And
in some of the points that have been raised.
Yes, and I would also, there's one question also, Vanessa, so I'll just give that to you, and then maybe you can wrap up giving a few points. Armando, do you need to say something at the end? Do you need a bit of time, or?
Yeah, I could say something about the next event of the post-pandemic.
Okay, we'll leave that then.
But just 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. So Vanessa, there's also a question there, which is that donors seem to be redirecting funds for climate to health. How can funders leverage the learning emerging from COVID-19 crisis to inform enhanced resilience? So I'll leave that, plus you can come back with any comments.
Yeah, so I have some comments of clarification, because the relationship between climate change and conflict is that Lisa raised is a very important question. And actually, it was one of the kind of prepared answers that we had for the media when we released the report, because obviously, as you remember, maybe our report was released on the same day, on the Monday after Russia had started his unjust war. So I say his because obviously it's Putin who's done it, but the one thing that, so there is, as you remember, the report is our systematic review of the evidence, what evidence we can have. So there is a lot of evidence about climate change driving civil conflicts, like intranational conflicts within a nation. But there is absolutely no evidence that climate change would drive a conflict like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, I know that, Lisa, there's some people putting the evidence, but the peer review evidence is not there. Not for the Ukraine case, of course, because it just happens just after the report was being reviewed, but also like other geopolitical conflicts are generally not associated to climate change impacts. The relationship, whatever it is not yet there. Maybe we need more evidence. Maybe this is a topic that we should be researching, because intuitively we all think this is something very true. So I guess maybe we have to compile the evidence for that. And the relationship between climate change and diseases is also interesting, because for example, with the COVID-19, I think they also, at the time of writing, we didn't have the evidence that it was necessarily caused by climate change. But of course, we have the evidence that climate change is causing many other conflicts, including zoonotic diseases, but also increasing prevalence of malaria, dengue, and other diseases. So the relationship, the impact of climate change on health is absolutely demonstrated, and I think it's super important. In the case of Ayesa's question about funding, redirecting funds for climate to health, I would say that adaptation funds should also go to health, because improving health outcomes improves adaptation in very vulnerable populations. So the question is whether you can direct them to address also simultaneously those inequalities and conditions of marginalization from health services. There was like the issue of individual behavior and behavioral change, and it's true that in the past there has been some research, a lot of research on individual behavior change as the solution to climate change, particularly consumer-based solutions. I don't think now today that's necessarily supported, certainly not in working group 2, which is the adaptation group, perhaps a little bit in working group 3, but which is the reducing carbon emissions. There's a strong emphasis on lifestyle changes, which it feels not as something that one individual can do, but it's something that society changes together. More like, so though I've always been very cautious about thinking about how people individually can change anything, I think we have to admit the evidence that that has to be part of a wide solution. And Andrea, I really loved your intervention, and I think an emotional response is completely adequate. And I think, I mean, sometimes I just laugh because I don't have any, I don't have any other face, you know. It's just like, what can you say? Like, sometimes it looks so hopeless. But at the same time, I'm not sure it's entirely hopeless. I think there's a lot going on, and yeah, I think it passes through understanding that the question of inequality is so core for climate change, and that's a way we can start thinking about collective resilience and so on. Because inequality not only compounds the impacts and magnifies impacts, but also inequality is also related to maladaptation, and it's demonstrated that people who are marginalized also suffer worse consequences of maladaptation. And of course, it's related with questions of democracy, which we are familiar with. I wanted to finish with an example, which is, somebody told me this example, we are doing some research in Philippines at the moment, and we were looking at different examples of innovations. And they were telling me the story of how they have communities had started, in a community, they had started to build this sea barrier with sandbags. And it didn't work perfectly, but somehow they got funds and they could improve it. And somehow they managed to live through a few years with those sandbag walls. But at some point, the government did an adaptation plan and decided to remove all that and build a big concrete wall, which the person who was telling me the story didn't realize that this wall probably had increased the risks, because in the event that, so for the small events, it will protect. But the moment there is an event that exceeds the capacity of protection of that barrier, the risk to the population will be higher because they will be faced also with barrier. But just the construction of the barrier had displaced half of the community because of the need of land for the barrier. So that's maladaptation. And so we would say maybe individual initiatives it's not good that these communities have a responsibility to build these sandbag walls. But the truth is that worked a lot better than what the government did. So I think I think these are not very new questions, but I think they're very important.
Thank you. Well, I just want to say a big thank you to Vanessa for coming and talking to us today, to Andrea and Lisa for their thoughts, Armando and Alex McFarlane and Aisha also for their work in the background. And I hope we've got to look at, scrape the surface on some of these issues that are rightly raised in this IPCC report. So big thank you to everyone. And I'll just hand over to Armando for the last word. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayesha, Cassidy. Thank you, Cassidy. I just wanted to also thank everyone who joined us today, to all our speakers. And I just wanted to say before you leave that we will have our last event in October of the post-pandemic in the South series. It's going to be about the politics of care in the global South and also in the global North. And it's going to be in charge of Jordana Ramallo, and we will also have Raktim Ray with us and some other guests. It's going to be in early October. We will soon confirm with you the date, but stay tuned for more information. So thank you again for being with us today. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vanessa, Lisa, Andrea, Cassidy, Alex, Ayesha. See you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.